Thank you, Patrick, and it is indeed swell to be here and be speaking with all you folks. It's always great to be speaking to fellow devotees of the unknown and on the cutting edge of at least, I don't know what we're on the cutting edge of something, but science doesn't accept it. Patrick, thank you, and I'd like to also thank Bill Bengston for inviting me here to speak before you tonight. And the third person I would like to thank is my wife, Susan. She's out there somewhere. She's responsible for my PowerPoint presentation. You know, I could write you a whole sheaf of patent claims on an airplane fuselage or on a landing gear, but gosh darn it, I can't do PowerPoint. So that's where we'll have to leave it. It looks as good as it does because of her. Basically, the little abstract that you should see there on the table in front of you gives a little synopsis of what I wish to speak about tonight, but basically it's the UFO problem, where we are and what's being done about it in the time I have to speak to you about it, to resolve things from a scientific basis. And it may be that our current science can't really unravel UFOs and the UFO phenomenon. It turns out to be a mighty complex problem. But I'll tell you a few little starts that people are making, and then we'll go into a few cases, recent cases, to show you what's going on. And also I'll throw a few statistics in there too, so you can see what types of numbers we're dealing with in present day UFO cases and UFO sighting reports. Hopefully I can get through that in my 40 minutes. There's one of the problems right there. Wasn't quite the one I was going to talk about, but it is a problem. Everybody's absorbed in something else. About 68 years ago, UFOs burst on the scene. And since that time to this time, we've had a plethora of sightings coming in. Many, many thousands of sightings, hundreds of thousands of sightings have probably been gathered through the 68 years. And again, as you all know, a certain percentage of those sightings are very spectacular things seen by credible people, to paraphrase General Samford from 1952. And they can't be explained. So we have this whole bulk, this whole hairball of cases that just can't be explained. We have a whole bunch of other ones that can be explained, but it's the unexplained ones we need to resolve. And those are the cases that, for various reasons that it would take another lecture to go through, science really hasn't dug its heels into looking at all these years. Yes, there have been some scientists, there have been some efforts, but basically we've been collecting cases for 68 years and haven't gone much beyond that. And we need to start working with the evidence that those cases present to find out exactly the metes and the bounds of our phenomenon here at hand. I have my own ideas as to what it is, my theory, my belief, and notice I use words that are subjective, is that of course we're dealing with a non-human phenomenon. But if I were able to prove it from a scientific basis, actually somebody would have done it long before I, and that just hasn't been done, unfortunately. Let's take a look a little bit at another look at the problem, and I will say no more on that. Here it is, folks. It's as simple as that. There is the problem. This is a graph and a study that was done by Claude Poher, a French physicist back in the early 1970s. He took UFO cases, both explained and unexplained, and he graphed them as a function of the number of reports on the y-axis versus the duration and time that each report lasted. The dotted line here are identified cases, IFOs. That's all the things that cause people to see UFOs, and clouds, satellites, planes, hoaxes, whatever. And these are the unknown cases. Again, cases that were looked at by people who were qualified to look at cases and make a decision as to whether it was known or unknown. And we can see that there's a distinct phenomenon there. It's as simple as that. And that's all you really need to say. I could finish the talk here and say that there's the UFO phenomenon. Let's do something about that middle curve there. And it would be nice if we could replicate that today, because I don't think a whole lot of scientists are paying too much attention to something that came out in 1971. But if we could, again, it would be a nice exercise to use current day cases to see whether or not this curve is still applicable. It damn well better be. Let's jump right into the meat of what I wanted to talk about, and that is how can we detect these unknown sightings and gather data from them to have scientists who are not necessarily in this room, who are not necessarily involved with MUFON or the Center for UFO Studies or any of the other UFO organizations. We need to get those people involved. Well, one of the things that some folks are working on is something called UFO detector and tracking apparatus. And this is headed up by Dr. Mark Rodiger, Dr. Teodorani, and the other folks I have up there on the screen. Dr. Masters here has invented a new spectroscope, and he's got a patent on it, I know, because he called me up and we were talking about it a little bit. So there's some pretty high-powered people here. And their intention is to make, and it's not really an original idea, UFO detectors have probably been talked about since 1947, but basically they want to make something that is sort of shares a bus, just a box of instruments. We might call that box of instruments the main unit there, and shown right here. The main unit would just have basic instruments in it. An all-sky camera, a little weather station, a magnetometer, an electrostatic detector. And this thing would just be set out in the field of a place where UFO sightings are occurring, for example. How is it powered? Well, when I read their report, it's powered by a long cable, a long extension cable. So it could be 1,000 feet long. So you do have to have it by a person's house. And hopefully that person whose house it's plugged into would be coming out once in a while to maintain the machine. But basically these instruments would be on all the time. And they would work in conjunction with other units. They might have 3 or 4 units set up in the area. I'm not sure they would communicate with one another, but they would be there gathering information. And if the results warranted it, they could add additional units. We see here an optical unit there on the right-hand side, and an electromagnetic unit there on the left-hand side. If we had funds for that, we could add additional instruments like a very sensitive video equipment, UV and IR cameras, Geiger counters, gamma ray detectors, this type of thing. And Mark they are raising money for this thing here, and I don't think a prototype has been built, but they do hope to literally have this up and running in the near future. And so that's where we stand with this project. And the good thing about it, among other things, is that it would use off-the-shelf equipment. They don't have to design any instruments that aren't currently out there, and just sort of plug these things into a bus, a common bus, and you could just add as many buses or as many suites of instruments to the primary unit as you wanted. A second UFO detector that's also being developed is by, it's called UFOTOG here. I guess it's an acronym for UFO photography. This is basically being headlined by Douglas Trumbull, who's a special effects guy in Hollywood. Some of you might be familiar with his name. He's worked on 2001, Silent Running, Close Encounters, and he's obviously an expert at equipment and knows what he's doing. He's made a little prototype detector of his own that for a while he was carting around on a truck. But now he and Mark D'Antonio, who's a MUFON fellow actually, he's a photo analyst, have collaborated to produce this thing. They call this thing a platter, but it's a tiny array of instruments that will have an all-sky camera. It will also have a device in there where it can detect an aircraft going ahead and pick up a transponder if it's on the aircraft, so that we know immediately whether we're dealing with an aircraft or maybe something else. They too will have like a gamma ray detector, a magnetometer, and the downside to theirs is that a lot of this equipment has to be designed to fit within this little round platter. It's not necessarily off the shelf. It will also be capable of signaling people when it's been activated through a GPS system and in contact with a satellite. So that's something that Mark's project, the UFO data doesn't have. I think I have another picture of it here. It's got solar cell panels on the side, so it does not need to be plugged into an extension cord. However, it will need regular maintenance, so that's where MUFON comes into the deal here. They hope to have qualified MUFON people come out to this box every every so often, periodically every week or whatever it might be, to both download information from the memory cards on board it and just check to see that everything's operating properly. Their plan is to have at least 3 of them in a triangular sort of an array so that they could triangulate on anything they might pick up, as opposed to just having one unit out there, sitting out there by itself. This is just a prototype. I don't think they actually have this one built either. And my guess would be that they're a little further behind than Mark Roediger and Dr. Masters on their project. But I can tell you from seeing both Trumbull and D'Antonio speak before the MUFON board here last year, they're deadly serious about this thing. And if they can raise the money, and some of it's already been raised, that they will have these things out in the field. So hopefully we will get some at least data, stuff that scientists can actually work with in a lab or study and graph out, as opposed to just another UFO report. The third one here is something called multiple anomaly detector and automatic recording. This thing is up and running, and it has been up and running for a long time. This is headed and run by one man out in Mount Vernon, Indiana, named Fran Ridge. Francis Ridge is a longtime UFO researcher. He goes back to NICAP days. He's been with MUFON, and now he's sort of spearheading a project called NICAP.org, where they sort of reanalyze and reinvestigate and try to put up a lot of documents of historic cases. If you go to the NICAP.org site, you will see all these cases. It's quite a bountiful. I'll have to speak a little bit. Oh, no, I won't have to speak louder. It's quite a bountiful array of data there. But Fran has been running this thing for many, many years, and it's much simpler than the 2 projects I just spoke about. He's basically got a bar, an iron bar or something, between 2 sort of boundaries. And it's the old UFO detector that people have spoken about for years, that if you get a magnetic perturbation in the magnetic field, it'll pull the central bar to one side or another and cause all kinds of stuff to go off in his house, lights and buzzers. And he's also got a Geiger counter, and a beta detector, and a gamma ray detector hooked up also to it. It's very simple, but it's working. And he gets a certain number of hits every year. And to date, however, he hasn't ever had it happen that there has been a local sighting and then his equipment goes off. On his site, he talks about the way he's found correlations, but they're not the correlations you would think. He seems to pick up stuff that happens way outside the range of his equipment. And it's almost in sync with waves of sightings that might be 500 miles away. He doesn't know why that's happened. And again, I have a short period of time here to talk about these things. But one of the interesting things that Fran's Madar thing picked up in 1977 occurred on August 15th of that year, when his instrument detected, it went off big time, in other words. The buzzers went off, the alarms went off. Fran went out there in the yard with the binoculars. His family ran all around the house. I guess the first thing he would do would be to shut off the buzzer. Then he goes outside. But he had something like a 209-second event, and he could never really explain what set that event off. Well, lo and behold, years later, he found out in the late 1990s that was the very time, the very day, that the WOW signal was received by the Ohio State University Big Ear Radio Telescope. Here's Fran's. You can see what we're dealing with here. Fran's a technical guy. He knows what he's talking about, but he's done all this sort of by himself. He hasn't gotten much outside funding. Individuals might maybe slide him a 20 every now and then, but it's all on a shoestring basis. Here's Fran in 1977, how his equipment would have looked back then when he picked up the signal on the very day of the WOW signal. He wasn't sitting there that day. The automatic recording, that's why you do automatic recording, so you don't have to do what he's doing right there 24 hours a day. There's the WOW signal. Fran's 209-second signal completely circumscribed that signal. It nested within his signal. No one's actually picked up on this in the larger world of science, but I think that's a kind of an amazing thing. Insofar as Fran could determine directions, it was even in the same direction as Ohio State University picked it up like Ohio State was, I think, looking southwest, and France stuff was looking northeast, and he figured it was to the northeast, and they figured their target in the sky was sort of in the southwest quadrant of the sky. So it almost seems like they were detecting the same thing. I don't know what to say about that, except that it's mighty intriguing. I listed here 3 of the primary organizations that are involved in UFO research today. I use the term kind of loosely, since one of the organizations isn't actually doing research per se. MUFON certainly is, the Mutual UFO Network. It has about 3,500 members who are getting thousands of cases in, investigators in every state. Everyone's trying to do a little bit to unravel these cases and to investigate every case that comes into the organization. The National Aviation Reporting Center on Aerial Phenomena, NARCAP, is run by Dr. Richard Haynes, again, a longtime UFO researcher. And his basically is looking at events that involve aircraft. If something seems to be interacting with an aircraft or passes in front of it or could pose a threat to an aircraft, he wants to know about it, both for airline safety and for furthering the study of what he would call UAP, okay, unidentified aerial phenomena. So his site, the narcap.org site, is filled with a bunch of technical papers. They did a really good paper on the O'Hare incident over Chicago a number of years ago, and how an object could punch a hole through the overcast, which the object that was seen that day was said to have done. Punched a clear hole through the overcast so you could see the sky above it. Well, what kind of energy would it take to heat up the air and punch a hole in the clouds? Well, you can read about that on his site. He's also done a report on how a sphere could fly through the air, you know, the physics and the aerodynamics of a sphere. How could it fly? How could it maybe generate lift? What could be behind this? So it's a very technical site. He has a board of directors and people who do solicit these reports, but they keep pretty much to themselves. They don't make a whole lot of public statements. They come out with news releases every once in a while. But you can bet that they'll probably be on that, or at least thinking about that drone thing that almost ran into it, that an aircraft passed by, I think it was at Kennedy Airport today, or New York today. Just one in a number series of aircraft passing very close to drones. Sometimes they're drones and sometimes they're not. We need to know about them all. And the last organization that I have down there is the National UFO Reporting Center. That's headquartered in Seattle, Washington, and it's run by Peter Davenport. And Peter's sole function here is to collect reports. He amasses large numbers of reports on his site. You can go on there, you can look back through all the reports from the years past. And he's a pretty out there guy. He's on a lot of internet radio programs, and he does a lot of interviews and this type of thing. He does not claim to be a researcher. He's not investigating these cases. Every once in a while, he will pass a case on to MUFON that he feels is significant. But he and MUFON and NARCAP don't, he doesn't really work too closely with any of those organizations, though we're all friends. Let's take a little look here at the phenomenon today. What volume of cases are we talking about? Here you'll see, like the graph says, the UFO sightings that were received in a particular year by MUFON. And last year they were slightly over 5,000 or slightly over 6,000. I have the exact figure here somewhere. A slight downward trend, but this is a large number of incoming cases. When you think that Project Blue Book, throughout its 22 years of history, collected something like, I think it was 12,000 cases. So MUFON gets in 1 year basically what Blue Book got in 22 years. Here's a breakout of again, the disposition of cases, what percentage were explained, what were unexplained. You can see the large segment there from the 12 o'clock position down to the 4 o'clock position. Might be a little hard for you to read, but that's basically the one we're all interested in. That's the unknowns. They stand at 33%. All the rest of the categories are basically IFOs or insufficient information. It's kind of interesting that the hoax is at 4%. The Project Blue Book always found hoaxes at 3% or so, so that number has stayed steady all these years. The unknowns, that's also within the range of percentages that we have gathered from 1947 to this day. Blue Book found a much smaller number of unexplained cases. They had 701 out of their 12,000. That was almost 40 and right there. And so they had a very small rate, 7% unknowns. The Colorado University of Colorado Condon Committee study had about a 33% unknown rate. The French people, when they looked at cases and actually tried to explain them or not explain them, they come up with a pretty high rate too of around 25 to 35% unknown. So the 33% is, again, it's a little at the little higher end, but totally consistent. What kinds of shapes? Again, I think everybody in here knows the kind of shapes that are being reported, but this just sort of reinforces that. The big blue one there, again, from about the 12 to the 4 o'clock position, is spherical and circular. And circular in this instance, I found out, was defined as simply a circle, no third dimension to it. Someone just sees a circular light in the night sky that has appreciable angular diameter. That would be circular, as opposed to something discoidal where you see the third dimension in there, you see the thickness of the thing. The disks are right in here. Triangles are here. We can talk theoretically, we could talk for quite a while about how the shapes have changed over the years. Well, were there more saucers back in the 40s and 50s being reported than triangular objects? Were there more cigar-shaped objects in 1970 than now? And yes, these categories have changed a little bit. They're not rigid. What we have seen drop off over the years, and this graph, this pie chart doesn't really reflect that, is the fact that there are very few CE2 cases and CE3 cases reported anymore. And by CE2s, I would mean a case where we have an object interacting with a car to cause it to stop, or interacting with a person to cause physical harm to them, burns, or it affects vegetation on the ground. A CE3 case, again, to refresh your memory, would be a case where an occupant of the object is seen. There's some kind of an entity present. Yes, they still come in. They don't come in quite in the numbers that they were in the 60s and 70s. And from my talking with other people who are sort of attuned into this, we do feel that it's an actual adjunct of the phenomenon. This is not a reporting phenomenon, or more people are not reporting these things where they did report them in the 50s or 60s. We think the phenomenon really has changed its modus operandi a little bit. But that's, again, that's something that we could look into statistically. Here's right up to date on UFO sightings that have been received by the MUFON Case Management System, the CMS. That's the database into which all incoming cases in MUFON are placed. These cases are then doled out to the state directors. So just through the first 4 months of this year, there's over 1,400 cases. These cases have not necessarily been investigated. And this was a snapshot of the day that I compiled these things, which I think was May 15th. I guarantee to you that the next day, May 16th, all these categories changed a little bit because some people still haven't reported a case that occurred to them in April. They might decide to log it into the CMS system next month or tomorrow or a year from now. So none of these categories, again, are static. California always leads. What can I say? It's a big state. Virginia's been trying its best, but it's just, what can I say? Let's look at the unknowns in here of just this sample that I just put up here, just through January, from January through April. We're seeing an unknown rate of 20.9%. I would almost venture to say that doesn't mean too much because a lot of these cases have not been investigated yet. So that percentage of 20.9 will go up or down. But again, you can see it's not 80%, it's not 70%. And again, logically thinking about this, I think you would come to the conclusion that there's an awful lot of stuff up there in the sky, and most of it is not a true UFO. It's an airplane or a satellite or whatever. So there's always going to be a lot more static than there is signal. The signal is always going to be kind of small. For comparison, I threw the National UFO Reporting Center stats in there. For the same time period, they have 1,700 cases. So Peters gets a few more cases than MUFON does. And admittedly, there's a huge overlap between these. But I don't know what percent of that overlap, how big that overlap is, how many people report to both organizations. It's unknown. let's take a look at a few, 5 cases I have here, all fairly recent for your intellectual enjoyment, I hope. The first case occurred about 2 years ago. It's a little outside the realm of I wanted to pick within the last year, the last few months. And I picked all these out from the CMS system myself, with the exception of this case, which was given fairly high priority in the organization. I think it was put on the front of their annual report. This was an interesting case, and it reveals one of the complete frustrations and aggravations that UFO researchers are well used to over the years. It occurred over Picayune, Mississippi. This was not a small deal, I'll tell you right now. This was kind of a big deal, and it involves 3 states. This pilot of a Cessna 172 took off from Louisiana, from Slidell, Louisiana, and just at about 3:15, 3:17 in the afternoon, this is a daylight sighting. That in itself is a good thing. And as he was flying north, due north, he noticed this object. He said it was about 8 feet off his wing. He was flying about 150 miles per hour. He thought the object was about 33 inches in diameter, okay? A little under a yard. It was circular or oval, and it had this sort of a fin sticking up here. That's a flat thing. And that flat thing was oriented with the longitudinal axis facing the direction of travel. It doesn't make very much sense aerodynamically, but a lot of stuff doesn't in ufology. That's what he reported. He watched it for 2 or 3 seconds, and the thing drifted off his wing due south. That was the entire sighting from the pilot's point of view. Well, MUFON immediately filed for radar reports from the Air Force, because there were a whole lot of radar detecting facilities in the area. Not all of them government by any means, but I think the Air Force in this case was sort of doling these things out. But they got a good response. The Air Force sent them all the files they had. And so here's the amazing, completely irritating thing. The Slidell Airport, which the pilot had just left, that radar picked up the aircraft, the Cessna, but not the UFO. In Citronelle, Alabama, to the east of the pilot, it picked up a UFO track, but didn't pick up the airplane. Moreover, while the pilot said the thing was just maybe 10 feet off his wingtip, the radar records show that the airplane on the unknown object never got closer than 5 miles. Let's take a look at one little bit of the radar report. Here's the aircraft, basically flying due north here at about 150 miles per hour. Here was the time of the sighting, about 3:26 or so in the afternoon. At 3:17, this is 3:17, this is the track of the unknown object, this rather meandering, nonlinear path. At 3:17, the pilot hadn't taken off yet. So although the aircraft looks like it's close to the UFO here, they're not close in time. They were not at all close there. The closest is, here's 3:26 for the aircraft, here's 3:26 for the unknown object. That's about 5 miles apart. Now, what about this odd track here? Well, we see that for a little while, this object put on a burst of speed at about 190 miles per hour, dropped down to 60 miles per hour, 38, and it's really moving slow there. Picks up the speed a little bit, and it loses a lot of time, enough time that the airplane finally is able to go this entire distance in a straight line. Bear in mind that if you say, well, it was just another guy flying in a Cessna, that the top speed of the Cessna, the not to exceed speed, is 188 miles per hour. They're serious about that when they say 188. They don't just mean around 188. That's what the aircraft safely will take you at. Moreover, the stall speed of a Cessna is about 54 miles per hour. This object here is going at a lot less than that. Here we see 38, 46, and it's flying this kind of convoluted pattern. I don't know what that thing was. The pilot is adamant that he didn't see something 5 miles away. That object would have been several thousands of feet in diameter if he had. He says it was, 8 to 10 feet off the wing, and he sticks by his story. Nobody else reported seeing anything that day. Again, I don't like to say how things would have been, like a lot of the debunkers sometimes do, but if this thing really were several thousand feet in diameter and it were 5 miles away from the pilot when he said it was 10 feet, I would have thought that maybe even in this area, not as heavily populated as here, of course, there would have been some reports of a 3,000-foot disk, but there weren't. Maybe we were dealing with two objects. That's how perverse this field sometimes gets. Maybe there was a little one and another one traveling abreast of it or at some distance from it. I don't know. But there you have it. That's the Picayune, Mississippi case. We move a little closer to home here. Richmond, Virginia, a little more than a year ago, March 8th. A person who was out walking his dog, or dogs, late at night or early in the morning, saw what he said was this sort of a triangular object you see there. And as he was watching, it was a rectangular object, it shot off what he said were three flares that more or less went straight down to the ground. And simultaneously, he hadn't seen this before, but there were some lights off to the left of this large rectangular object. And those objects immediately merged with the larger one. This thing was seen close by. Do I have the actual? I wanted to get the distance on some of these if I could. These are not pinpoints of light in the sky we're talking about here. I tried to pick cases where the object couldn't be, it wasn't a misinterpretation of an aircraft or a star or a satellite. Well, I guess they don't have it on this one. But anyhow, it was large enough that he could easily ascertain that this thing was rectangular. And it had lights around the periphery of it like you see there. These rectangular things seem to be increasingly common in reports. I can tell you that this odd phenomenon of shooting things out of the object straight down toward the ground almost goes back to June 24th, 1947. I have a case that occurred on that day, I believe it was. And a few years ago, we had a sighting of this, the same kind of phenomenon from a football-shaped object at Houston International Airport, I think it was, where a pilot twice saw a football-shaped object disgorge a little red flare straight down toward the ground, more or less on the entrance path to planes coming in on their final approach to the airport. It was a very good sighting. But again, that's something that goes back many, many years in the UFO literature. October 2014, Columbus, Indiana. This was a woman who was living with her parents temporarily, felt a strange compulsion to go out and smoke a cigarette. And she did smoke cigarettes. It wasn't that she never smoked and suddenly thought, God, I gotta have a cigarette. But I will say, thank God for people who smoke and walk dogs. We wouldn't have a lot of sightings. I can't think of anything good about smoking, but we do get an increased number of UFO reports from people who are outside smoking cigarettes. Yeah, Sue can tell you how many cases she sees where I was out having a smoke when, you name it. This person both works for an airline, she's a flight attendant, and she's a nursing student. I don't know how she fits it all in, but somehow she does. This object, she thought, she readily knows all her stuff about aircraft, so she's not going to be fooled by a simple airplane going across the night sky. She felt this object was pretty high, 15 to 20,000 feet high. It had a dark main body here, and it had what she described as blood red lights. I thought that was kind of funny coming from a nursing student. She said the color of the red was like the venous blood coming back to the heart, a deep red or something like that. And it also had these white lights somewhat around the leading edge that you can see there. The odd thing about those lights was that they were not, the drawing sort of shows them symmetrical, but she says there were like more on one side than on the other. Again, UFOs often seem to exhibit these weird asymmetries that you just can't explain why that is. And it also gave off what she could see as a wisp of a trail or something behind it as it was moving through the sky. She called her mother out when the object was still fairly small in the sky. And so they had two witnesses to this thing. And it alternately moved along a course. I forget which way this was moving. I think it was moving to the east. It sort of doesn't matter. But it would stop and hover for minutes at a time. The thing wouldn't move. Then it would start up again and move. So that it took about 15 minutes or so for this thing to go from in the distance to straight overhead to fading from view along its linear path. A very odd kind of a thing. Fox Island, Washington State, November 20th, 2014. We had a MUFON board meeting, a telephonic board meeting that night. I wonder if that had anything to do with it. And anyhow, Fox Island is a little island out in Puget Sound. It's connected to the mainland by a bridge. This was a case where we had a number of witnesses. A young man and his girlfriend were traveling in separate cars, actually, to his house. It couldn't have been that late in the evening. I forget the exact time on this thing. Yeah, 8 o'clock in the evening. And they saw this thing that he described as basically sort of like well, he said this was a globular cockpit, his words, with two wings extending, somewhat swept back from the thing, so that it was moving in this direction. Red lights along the edges of the wings, and there were two of these objects. One was somewhat further back, and he was flabbergasted. He stopped the car, looked at these things. I think he even put down the window and looked out of the car. But the amazing thing was that through his windshield, the object filled the entire windshield. And so we're not talking about a small object here. His girlfriend also saw it. He maneuvered his car around to see the object better, and when he looked up again at it, the object was gone. He went on home and told his father about it, and his mother came home some 20 minutes later from an errand or whatever, and she reported that she saw these objects too. In this case, they were slightly transposed from where he had seen them, where the man, the fellow and his girlfriend has seen them. She saw one of them hovering over a marsh, and then she drove a little bit and went around a bend, and she thought she saw the same one hovering over water. But then when she realized that her son had seen two of them, she thought, well, maybe I saw the same two. They just maneuvered to a different position. But that's the Fox Island, Washington case. There was no sound heard. The witnesses were very disturbed by what they had seen. And all of these cases that I'm showing you here today, these 5, and all the cases I speak about in detail like this, they've all been investigated and come up with the unknown category. You could argue that the investigator was wrong or something, but that's the imprimatur that MUFON has given on these cases. And here's the last one I have, King George, Virginia. This was a case that was investigated by one of Sue's chief investigators, a fellow named Norm Gagnon. Just occurred a little over a month ago. A woman driving down a road saw this, again, a rectangular object with 3 white lights along the shorter end. So the object was traveling toward the left here. I think she was on Route 301. This thing was going somewhat to the east. She was heading south. And lights on the back with 1 red light in the middle there. She did an interesting thing. She did what we call, people who have worked in the field for a long time would call escalation of hypotheses. She first thought she was looking at 2 airplanes and then maybe 1 airplane, and she tried to rationalize it with something she knew, but it didn't work. She said, I was drawn to the conclusion, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this was a large rectangular object with lights on either end. She said it had a dark body, and you couldn't see clouds or the sky through this thing, but it was basically opaque. She thought it was like dark glass, and she from reading the report, I found that she found it hard to put into words what exactly she was looking at on the dark part of that object. Like it might have been wavery a little bit, or like streaked glass, or something just didn't seem right about that center part to her. But she watched this thing, and it just, like all these things, it just flew out of range, and that was it. And that's the last case I have to tell you, and I'll leave you with General Samford's words again. Boy, I hate picking Air Force guys, but Samford had some memorable things he said in his press conference back in '52. The barrier of understanding on all this, he said, is not one that's often crossed, and I would echo those words today. And that's my presentation, and I will be glad to hopefully try to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. If not, you're all free to leave and roam about the country. and Ron will come up next. Oh no, I don't.
Yeah, I just wanted to know if you would, some of the things look like photographs. Some were obviously drawings, so it's obvious that the person who saw it drew it. But in a couple of them, I wasn't sure whether somebody had taken the photograph with a cell phone. If you could just say which ones were actually photographs and which were drawings.
Well, that's a good question. I should have stated that. None of these were photographs. The answer is very simple. All of them were either the witness drawings or the investigator's rendition. The really good ones that I last showed and the earlier one of a rectangular object were both done by Norm Gagnon, who is an artist. The rest were done by the witnesses themselves drawing these things.
One of the enigmas in my mind is MUFON and its association with Robert Bigelow. Robert Bigelow that had NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science, multi-billionaire, the only guy that owns Bigelow Aerospace and the only private citizen that actually has 2 satellites in orbit right now, but very interested in UFOs, and at one point contracted the researchers from MUFON, called the STAR team, to actually, gave them credit cards, the whole works, to actually go out and investigate possible or reported landings of UFOs, and then within a year withdrew his support mysteriously. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I know an awful lot about that, and it would take far more than Patrick Queege would never permit me to answer that question at the length it would take. But basically, it wasn't too mysterious. There were internecine problems, if you want to think of it like that, between Robert Bigelow and MUFON that the project sort of ran aground on, and rightly or wrongly on his part and on MUFON's part, it fell apart. And we had access to all the data. He didn't take any data and not show it to us. But I will tell you from personal experience on 2 occasions with Robert Bigelow, that episode with MUFON and an earlier episode with the UFO Research Coalition, he is not an easy man at all to work with. And I think his motivations are true. He wants to find out, just like we do, what's going on, but he's not easy to work with. That's a good question, though. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, you seem to have an interest in detection of UFOs, making a lot of detectors. Have you tried to tap into any of the radars in the country?
The radars where?
Yeah, I mean, all you need is a receiver and a little bit of processing. There are military radars, there are NASA radars, there are TV, there are all kinds of high power sources out there. If you can monitor the source and you can monitor the reflections, you've got a radar.
Right. No one has actually done that yet. They've talked about it, but no one has actually picked up on that. In UFO history, there was someone that did that back in the early 50s on some sightings that occurred around Oak Ridge, Tennessee. He was a private citizen and he bought a radar set. That disconcerted the Air Force quite a bit, but he did pick up some stuff with that radar set back then, if memory serves. But yeah, that is, if I understand your question.
You don't need the whole radar, all you need is the receivers.
Yeah. Peter Davenport of the National UFO Reporting Center, he has a project that he wants that, exactly what you're talking about, to occur. But so far, no one's put up the money or done that yet. But I agree with you, it's worth pursuing that.
Hello. I've got 2 questions. I'll just run through them.
Mm-hmm.
First question is, I'm just curious, does your colleague Francis,
Fran Ridge, yeah.
Does his detector detect airplane or aircraft as well? Like, how would it know to detect anomaly?
That's a good question. I have given some thought to that. I haven't exactly read on his site, but I think he has got his instrument sort of sensitized that it's not overly sensitive to a passing aircraft or a passing car setting the thing off. Otherwise, Fran would have been divorced long ago because the thing would go off every 5 minutes. But no, there's a margin built in there that takes a pretty large perturbation of the magnetic field beyond just an aircraft going by to set that thing off.
And
and he's never reported seeing an airplane go overhead either, that I know of, when he hears it going off.
And my second point is that if the reports of UFOs being truly anomalies, they disappear, or they're not there, then they appear, and so fast, and so all these things, it would make sense that if his detector is detecting something, it's something within an anomalous flavor to it, Oh, so it's picking up something 300 miles away, out of range. Makes sense because it's a quantum detector, or they're quantum anomalies.
Yeah. I can't really deny that. Specifically with regard to Fran Ridge finding this odd correlation between sightings that occurred hundreds of miles away from his detector, which maybe has a range of 30 miles. He's picking up something that seems to be the leading edge of what then occurs a day later in New Mexico or someplace. I can't explain it at all, but it could be what you said.
Yeah, because we're talking about where time and space, I mean, what we're all investigating and learning about is where there are events or perceptions outside of time and space as we know it, or events outside, and this seems...
This seems to fall right into that.
Yeah.
I can't but agree with you there on that. Yeah, give a look at his site and see what you think about his reports on that. In the MADAR, you'll see a little hyperlink down there on his site. And you can see a lot more than I talked about here today.
Okay, thank you very much,
again,
Rob.
folks.